Hello, everybody. I would like to welcome you all to this webinar on sustainability in procurement. This webinar comes as a side event of the annual meeting of the Islamic Development Bank. And this webinar is organized jointly between ISDB, the World Bank, and the Federation of Consultants from Islamic countries. The issue to be discussed in this webinar is sustainability in procurement. And sustainability has been the focus of international development agencies in their approach to development. And of course, as a means of ensuring sustainability of finally delivered projects, we must ensure that sustainability is part and parcel of the procurement process. This is the issue that we'll be discussing in this webinar. And for this purpose, we have lined up a distinguished panel of experts to address the issue of sustainability in procurement from three different aspects. The first one relates to procurement guidelines and requirements. And the second one relates to sustainability in as a concept in design, engineering design for development project. And the third aspect, we are going to reflect on the Egyptian government experience related to sustainability in public-private partnership. For the essence of time, I would like to introduce all participants up front and then allow the floor for them to speak. Our first speaker will be Mr. Amir Mirgani, the manager of procurement division at ISDB. Mr. Amir Mirgani has 22 years of experience in development and with international organizations, including the ISDB. Our second speaker will be Mr. Husham Mirgani, head of training of the project procurement division of ISDB, who has extensive experience in procurement and contract management in multidisciplinary sectors. Our third speaker will be Mr. John Roland Williams of the World Bank. He's a senior procurement specialist with the World Bank with a wide experience in sustainable development in construction and ICT complex sectors. Our Danish speaker will be Mr. Atir Hamouda, the director of PPP Central Unit at Ministry of Finance, Egyptian government, who has a wide experience with multinational organizations, including World Bank, USAID, and he's an expert in management information system and procurement. Our last but not least speaker, Mr. Munsif Diani, an independent consultant and vice president of FCIC. He has 40 years of experience in development of multidisciplinary projects in different countries around the world. Mr. Munsif was an ex-member of the executive committee of FIDIC and founder and director of CID of Morocco, and currently he's vice president of FCIC. Myself, Mohammed Abdurrahman, I'm the president of FCIC. I was formerly executive committee member of African group of FIDIC, members of FIDIC, and also a member of Integrity Management Committee of FIDIC. And I manage a consulting engineering firm under the name of Neotech Consulting Group. Mr. Amir Ghani of ISDB, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Distinguished participants, honorable panel members from World Bank, Federation of Consultants, and Ministry of Finance, Egypt representative. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. On behalf of the Islamic Development Bank, I would like to thank you all for joining us today for this first online seminar as part of series of events leading to the Islamic Development Bank 2022 annual meeting to be held in Egypt during 1st to 4 June 2022. We have selected this important topic because of its critical contribution to economy, society, and the long-term development. Sustainable procurement will go beyond economic consideration and take into account long-term aspect, social, environmental, and also help us to deliver better value for money and realize long-term benefits for the investment to the beneficiaries. I would like to share with you my thoughts on three important aspects of sustainable procurement. First, why sustainable procurement is critical to deliver the better outcomes and development. Second, ISTB's effort towards sustainable procurement. And lastly, what are the key challenges in adopting the sustainable procurement approach? Ladies and gentlemen, public procurement is a crucial component in public service delivery at international, national, and the local level. Worldwide, governments spend approximately 9.5 trillion in public contracts every year. This huge size of the public procurement on average constitute around 12 to 20% of the GDP of the developing countries. Thus, efficiency of the public procurement is central to increase the value gains for achieving sustainable development goals through the investment that is made by the government as well as by the donor investment. The global community have adopted Sustainable Development Goal in 2015, which call for pursuing development by ensuring that the benefits of these development interventions are lasting, minimize use of natural resources, and also realize a better value. Transformative steps which are urgently needed to shift the development onto a sustainable path, and procurement has to play a central role in this process. Sustainability aspect related to procurement specifically covered the SDG indicator 12.7 that calls for promoting a procurement practices that are sustainable and are in accordance with the national policies and the priorities of the member country. Despite these commitments agreed in 2015, the current public procurement system in number of developing countries is yet to adopt sustainable approach in the procurement processes and in contracts. This limits their ability to deliver value for money and provide more economical, innovative, and environmental friendly and socially sustainable solutions through procurement of goods, works, and services for the beneficiaries. Value for money principle followed by the MDBs need to be broadened so that the beneficiary can obtain the optimal benefits through effective, efficient, and competitive procurement process that will also ensure economic use of the resources and applying the sustainability related consideration. The value for money will only be achieved with clear statement of sustainable procurement objectives, needs, with due consideration to social, economic, environmental, and technological related aspects. And also it is done at very early stage when the procurement planning is done, when the design of the procurement arrangements are finalized, when assessment is done during the bidding evaluation process, and these are materialized during the contract execution stage. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to inform you that bank has finalized realigned strategy for the next 3 years, 2023-2025, that will be adopted during the coming annual meeting in Egypt that calls for inclusive, green, and sustainable development with due consideration to socio-economic environmental consideration in all projects that will be financed by the bank. The ITB has already developed some sustainable procurement requirement with consideration to gender, child labor, social and environmental consideration. Banks' environmental and social safeguard policy, climate change policy, sustainable finance framework, and policies of youth, gender, and women-related aspects guide the bank's intervention toward a sustainable approach to development. Under the new procurement framework of the bank adopted in 2019, efforts are being made to design fit-for-purpose procurement arrangement with due consideration to the country's situation, especially the countries that are already facing social and environmental risks. The overall objective of all these initiatives is to ensure that investment of the banks delivers sustainable solutions, better value for money, and long-term benefit to our member countries. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I would like to add some of the efforts Procurement Division has undertaken in preparing the guiding notes on social, gender, and sustainable procurement, covering the aspect of environment, social, health, safety standard, and gender aspects. The requirements of these are well reflected in our procurement process and the document. I'm also pleased to highlight that the Islamic Development Bank was the pioneer within the MDBs to develop and use life cycle cost approach to assess the long-term impacts and the benefits rather than having consideration to the purchasing price in procurement of goods, works, and services. Since 2020, ISTB in the procurement arrangement for all the projects is undertaking comprehensive due diligence and preparing the procurement strategies based on the market analysis, capacity analysis, and also environmental, social, health, and safety considerations. Based on the risk assessment of each project, it is putting in place a safeguards and mitigation plan that include the monitoring mechanism for the contract provision during the implementation. The standard bidding documents include the requirement for an environmental and social management plan, including the code of conduct, safeguard against the gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, and abuse. Employment on these projects to be in line with the standard of the ILO and also ISTB women empowerment policy, child labor remediation plans to ensure the safety of the local community, ensuring that the water resources protection plans are in place, and bidding document define the standards of the behavior from the competitive bidders, including declaration of their past performance on these minimum standards. These minimum contents of the code of conduct from these bidders are expected in the bidding process of ISTB. During the bid evaluation process, defining evaluation criteria for sustainable procurement, including technical requirement, qualification, and post-qualification requirements are clearly specified. We also look in detail on the requirements and the bill of quantities and ensure that the necessary legal provision to safeguard are included in the contracts. The bank has also the guidance note on the contract management practices, which require verification of environmental and social safeguard requirements, safety and health requirements for the winning bidders, and also in the contract to manage and mitigate adverse environmental and social health and safety related challenges. Regular review and update of the contract management related risks provisions are covered, and that these requirements are ensured to be implemented during the execution process. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude by highlighting the three key challenges that we continue to face in successfully realizing a sustainable procurement. First and foremost is, since the concept, approach, framework are being developed and evolved and institutionalized, these provisions are gradually integrated into standard bidding documents and the contracts. However, process of proper assessment, effective reflecting of these provisions in the procurement process and ensuring compliance and the monitoring during the contract execution stage remain a challenge. This is mainly due to the lack of the resources for effective implementation of these provisions in the procurement process. Efficient monitoring, dispute resolution mechanism, and sanction process are yet to be in place that will ensure the effective implementation. Lastly, the collective efforts are needed to build the capacity in respective government agencies, multilateral development bank and development financing institution, especially in the contractors who are working on these projects, and also especially the beneficiaries and relevant stakeholders in preparing, assessing, monitoring, and compliance with the sustainable procurement requirements that are critical for the success of the sustainable procurement. My colleagues from the World Bank as well as the ISTB, they will presenting to you in detail sustainability framework and its use in the procurement processes of the MDBs. I'm also grateful to our colleagues from the Government of Egypt for sharing with us the story of the public-private partnership project, and also our colleague from Federation of Consultants to share the experience of the consultant in mainstreaming the sustainable approach to development. Let me conclude by thanking you all once again for your attention and wish you a very productive seminar today. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. With this, I hand you back the floor, Mr. Chairman of the FCCITC. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Amir Ghani. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Hisham Mirrani. Mr. Hisham, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the introduction. So I will be presenting a concise and hopefully clear introduction on sustainability in procurement. I will be taking just about 10 minutes, and some of the aspects presented here concisely will be elaborated, by the other speakers in their presentations. Next slide, please. So let's start by defining sustainable procurement. Let's go to the next slide, please. Sustainable procurement. So let's start with our guidelines. So we have introduced, new procurement guidelines. They have been effective since April 2019. They are, in line with international best practices, and they're also harmonized with the other MDBs. So right at the beginning, on the first page of these guidelines for procurement of goods and works, in paragraph 1.5 up, as you can see, in the core procurement principles, there is this statement: these principles support beneficiaries to deliver sustainable development with integrity. So this is, fundamental, that sustainable development, is a core objective, that we are targeting. So let's go to the next slide, please. So sustainable development is a term that has been around for, more than 30 years. So you can see here, this definition is defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I think all of us, have come across this definition before. So it's a very important definition that we need to keep at the forefront, of our minds. And as I said, it's been around, for quite a while. Next slide. So sustainable development has three main pillars, and this is very important. And as you can see, they are economic, environmental, and social. And let me elaborate a little bit on these three in the next slide. Okay, so you can see here some of the considerations, and I will pause here for a moment. You can see a lot of very different considerations under each one of these pillars. And let me be practical in illustrating this. Let me take the energy sector as an example, which is a very important sector, I think, in development. Roughly about 25% of the active portfolio of ISDB is in the energy sector, which is, several billions of dollars, under implementation at the moment. So the current trend, many countries are going for renewable energy projects, solar and wind, for example. So a few years back, this was a challenge when doing the feasibility study. It was a challenge to justify these projects because on environmental considerations, they are clearly contributing to, reduction in CO2, which is under the environmental pillar in carbon emissions. However, do they deliver value for money? Because the feasibility study in many cases showed that the tariff resulting from the high initial cost of these projects was not competitive compared to, say, other alternative sources. For example, coal or natural gas, especially in countries where fossil fuels are abundant. So this was a consideration. Another source of renewable energy is hydropower, for example. And here the considerations are different. So environmental and social can play a big part in the considerations when you are developing hydropower projects. Let's take as an example, one of the largest projects that the ISDB contributed to financing in recent years was the Atbara Dam project. I worked on this project for several years. So the consultant did a detailed environmental and social impact assessment, and there was an EMP or an environmental management plan produced as a result, as well as a resettlement action plan to deal with social aspects, because there were about 100,000 affected local inhabitants who needed to be resettled. So this project was implemented over a period of about 6 years, from 2010 to 2016. And the final cost of the project was around about $1.5 billion. And a large component of that was the cost of the resettlement. There were about 30,000 houses constructed during this 6-year period to resettle, about 100,000 who were affected. So you can see that social considerations can play, can be a considerable component, in hydropower projects. During this webinar, we will have, a good example of another, sustainable, energy project, which is a waste to energy project, which is a project that is being currently worked on by the Egyptian government, and this will be in a later presentation. When you are developing thermal power stations, for example, as just mentioned, we have a guidance note on life cycle costing, and it's very important to consider this when you are developing thermal power stations, because you need to look at the operation and maintenance cost, especially issues related to efficient fuel utilization, for the different machines. So when you are procuring the machines or the turbines, are you just looking at the least cost turbines that are complying with the specification, or are you looking at the life cycle costing, where you could have considerable efficiencies in fuel consumption? Let's take another example. A recent thermal power station completed in one of our member countries, a 500 megawatt power station that is using crude oil. So this power station, when working at full capacity, it's consuming 18,000 barrels of crude oil a day. So at current prices, which are over $100 per barrel, so this power station will consume about $1.8 million per day. So you can see, if you do life cycle costing and you get even just maybe 5%, savings in fuel consumption, this will have a considerable, impact, on the economy of the project. So these are some of the considerations. In short, sustainable development, there are lots of considerations under the 3 main pillars in sustainable development, and your specific project could maybe focus or have as its priorities, some of these specific considerations, that need to be focused on and worked on. Next slide, please. Sustainable procurement. So I think the definition, follows logically from what we have just mentioned about sustainable development. So sustainable procurement is a process which incorporates sustainability considerations throughout the procurement process in order to achieve optimal value for money, or VFM, in delivering development objectives. Next slide, please. So sustainable procurement is a commitment. This has been mentioned just now. So the Sustainable Development Goals have been committed to by the International Development Community in 2015. Most countries of the world have committed to the SDGs, as well as the International Development Community. So this is under SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production. And within SDG 12, it is target 12.7, which is to promote sustainable public procurement practices. So this is an international commitment. So we need, to follow through on this commitment and actually implement it in practice. So we need to see what we are doing. Let's go to the next slide, please. Next. So as mentioned now, so our current procurement guidelines, have this as a core fundamental objective, which is to achieve sustainable development. We also have a guidance note, as you can see here. It gives guidance on how to incorporate environmental, social and gender and other sustainable, considerations in public procurement. And this guidance note is available. It can be freely downloaded from our website. Next slide. And this is the last slide. So in addition to the guidance note, we have the standard procurement documents, or the standard bidding documents, if you like. So these include certain environmental, social, health, and safety requirements that contractors need to comply with. And this includes the code of conduct regarding ESHS obligations that apply to the contractors' personnel. And it also includes the management strategies and implementation plans, to manage various issues such as water resources, pollution, waste, and so on. And in general, the ISDB is committed to harmonizing the standard bidding documents with the other MDBs. This is a commitment between the multilateral development banks. So if you look at our bidding documents, and you look at the World Bank bidding documents or the other MDBs, you will find they are similar to a large extent, maybe 80% or more. So the approach is harmonized, and this includes also the approach to the environmental, social, health, and safety issues. So the elaboration, I believe, you will get in the next presentation. And so with this, I will stop here, and I will hand back to the moderator. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hisham Mirani. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. John Roland Williams of the World Bank. And I would like to extend our apologies to you, John, for waking you so early. We are in a different part of the world where our working day is almost concluding now. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chair. So good morning, afternoon and evening to everybody. It's an honor to be here today to talk about such a critical subject, something that is obviously very close to the core of the work that all the development banks undertake. Next slide, please. So from the bank's perspective, we've had two major reforms that impact sustainable procurement and sustainability in general. So the first major reform was where the bank's previous guidelines were changed and brought up to date to reflect international good practice. And the new procurement framework was launched in 2016. At the same time, it was acknowledged that the safeguard policies needed reform as well. And although the procurement reform happened, was approved by our board sooner, there was an ongoing commitment that we'd make sure the two integrated together, in particular making sure the bank's standard procurement documents reflected the environment and social framework requirements. So the first point really to point out the link is that the key link is in the ESF, which is the environment and social framework, which I will call ESF 3 going forward. But it says in ESS1, which is the first standard, the borrower is responsible for all environmental and social risk and impacts at all stages of the project. And then the annex to that says the management of contractor, and has already been noted, a lot of delivery is through third parties for the IFIs. So that's through suppliers. So the management of contractors, the borrower used this procurement process to require contractors to manage specific E&S risks, environmental social risks. What I'm now going to do is talk about how the bank, for want of a better word, has operationalized the ESF through the procurement process. Next slide, please. So first of all, we're just going to show you the cascading effect. So the bank has its policies, the ESF, and the first part of this is actually within the financing agreement that the client will sign for the finance. There are specific mentions of E&S risks and impacts associated with that individual project. And the requirements to manage those and take care of those is actually built into the financing agreement. So that's where it starts. At the next level, client, the borrower, when they undertake procurement, they obviously need to follow the bank's procurement regulations. And within the bank procurement regulations is a strong support to the environmental and social requirements. And these are included within the bidding documents. So our standard procurement documents have all been updated to cover the E&S requirements. But we've also gone a step further than what we had previously, and I'll talk about that shortly. So from the borrower, the procurement activity cascades those environmental and social requirements to the contractor. And then also there's a commitment from the contractor to do the same with their subcontractor. So this flows all the way down the supply chain. We then have something called a primary supplier. I'm not going to try and explain exactly what it is because it's fairly complex, but it's not what everybody would probably consider from a procurement perspective as being the primary supplier, which is often thought as the prime supplier. This would be a supplier who is providing, for example, raw materials to the project. So they are a subcontractor, but they have a special classification within the ESF framework. Next slide, please. So just to sort of elaborate a little bit further on the requirements of the cascading of the ENS obligations. So ESS1, as I've already mentioned, gives the responsibility to the borrower to manage the environmental and social risks. They have to assess, manage, and monitor. And then the impacts of each stage of each of the risks are built into each stage of the project. Again, just repeating what I've already said, is that those obligations have to be passed on to the contractors. And of course, to make that effect passed on to the contractors, they have to be built into the contract. And during a lot of training that we've been doing with our colleagues within the bank, we re-emphasize time and time again that if it isn't in the contract, it isn't going to get done. So the key lever here is making sure the requirements associated with environment and social are built into the contract. And I'll go through that in a bit more detail as we move through the presentation. So just to go into a little bit more detail, the borrower must include relevant E&S obligations in its contract with the contractor who will deliver the works and the supervising engineer. So from the bank's perspective, we've not only integrated E&S into our standard procurement documents for works, large works, but we've also updated our requirements for consultants to include the obligation to make sure that E&S risks are being managed and covered as part of the supervising engineer's role and any other consultants who are associated with the delivery of the project. Next slide, please. So just to put into context how many different components of the ESF actually impact and cascade to contractors. We basically read through the ESF and identified anything that mentioned something that would have an impact on suppliers or something that suppliers would need to do. And as you can see, the list is pretty comprehensive. It's quite a task, but we think we captured everything. And at the bottom, you'll see there's an index. So F for FIDIC, P for particular, and S for specification. That really covers the bank's way of working. So we have an approach that FIDIC, general conditions, meet international standards. But the bank, through its ESF, has driven practice to a higher standard. For bank projects, the E&S requirements are perhaps higher than the general FIDIC conditions. So what we've had to do is create particular conditions that emphasize those points, as well as changing some of the FIDIC standard conditions. conditions. So at a generic level, FIDIC will cover project risks, and we'd expect that to cover project risks across all projects. The particular conditions cover the risks that the bank has identified across most of its projects and linked to its policy on ESF. And then specification are the individual risks that occur at a project level. And what I'll do now is talk that process through a little bit further. But if you look at, say, forced labour, we cover that under bank particular conditions because the requirements that the bank has around forced labour are higher than anything that would appear in FIDIC associated labour. If we look at design and safety, it's actually covered in all three. It's covered in FIDIC, it's covered in our particulars, and it's covered in our specification. FIDIC obviously gives an international standard. Our particulars add to that. And then at specification level, individual risks are identified, and those requirements are then built in into the specification. Next slide, please. So this is a standard procurement process. You'll all be familiar with it. What I want to do is just highlight some key areas within the procurement process that E&S is a very important attribute. So analysing and planning, stage one, it is particularly important when the assessment of the market, of capacity, of the dynamics within the market, who the key suppliers are, what's currently happening in terms of competition, etc. A key element of that assessment also needs to include the E&S assessments. So right at the beginning, you're trying to design the E&S elements into the procurement process. Once you've identified those, it then becomes far easier when you approach the market to include the E&S considerations in the bidding document. And that, as we've already mentioned, can be at a specification level, it can be at an award criteria level, it can be at a qualification level. But the key for us is making sure the right questions are asked within the market approach to make sure you get answers to the key areas of risk, whether that be through your environment and social implementation plan, or whether that be just through a narrative around the methodology. The next element I'd like to highlight is the evaluation of bid. I've already mentioned that you need to make sure that the requirements are built into the specification and the questions are asked about making sure the information is submitted to do the evaluation. Well, this is obviously where that takes place, and you can use that to determine the most advantageous bid or proposal. The ability to use rated criteria is a tool that really enhances the ability to assess the E&S capabilities of an individual supplier. Then award the contract, and as I've already mentioned, if you don't build those components into the contract, if you've missed a requirement within the contract associated with a particular E&S issue, it's unlikely to be covered by the contractor, because the contractor will not have costed it into their proposal for that. Therefore, I'll say it again, if it's not in the contract, it probably doesn't get done. So getting the contract drafting right is a critical stage. And then, as already been mentioned, there's a phrase in procurement that has been around many years, which is a terrible phrase, but it has an element of truth to it, which is let and forget. Often procurement's responsibility is to let a contract, and then they move on to the next contract because their performance is measured around how many contracts they let. Clearly, to deliver the right outcomes, you have to manage the contract, because all the good work you maybe have put in the first 5 stages can be lost if the contract isn't managed appropriately, if the client doesn't undertake their obligations, if the supplier doesn't undertake their obligations. So active contract management is a key part of making sure E&S requirements are delivered. You can support that by building KPIs into the contract. You can support that by having appropriate change control. Now, all too often, E&S risks are managed in the contracting process, but then there's a change. Something's happened on the ground, they need to change something. Change control comes through, a different way of doing it comes through, and the E&S risks are forgotten. So you can end up perhaps with unsafe working practices just because the change control has changed what was already in the contract. And then, of course, the final part of the contract is there is a carrot and there is a stick. and the stick is the remedies that can be applied when appropriate. So in the rest of the slides now, I'm going to go through in more detail exactly how this works from the bank's perspective. Next slide, please. So I keep talking about the need to integrate E&S into the bidding documents, into the contract. So these are just some of the features that we've put in place that actually shines a light on the need for good E&S performance. So the first one is a declaration of past E&S performance. And this can help the borrower inform their due diligence. So just because somebody has had a poor performance on a particular project, that doesn't automatically mean that that supplier won't be involved in the bidding process. It's a signal that more work needs to be done to actually understand what happened and why, and what the consequences of that were. The second, as I've already mentioned, is making sure the E&S activities and obligations are built into the specification. And they're often, as I've mentioned, things that are very specific to a project. The bidder needs to respond with the MSIP. So that's basically the E&S management strategy and implementation plan. So this is based on what a contractor would see as their first ideas around what that would look like. Often that is updated once the contract starts during mobilization. There is a code of conduct, and as...
Sorry, my headphones have just switched off. Hopefully you can still hear me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you hear me okay? Sorry about this.
Yes, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Let's try it again.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'm back working again now, so sorry about that. Trying to move something. That's great. So the code of conduct describes the minimum requirements that contractors, staff are expected to adhere to. The bank has developed a code of conduct, and as a minimum, contractors need to work to that code of conduct. They can actually enhance it, but they can't detract from it. So they can build on it, but they can't detract from it. And in particular, one of the risks that we ask contractors to really focus on within the code of conduct is sexual exploitation and abuse. And I have some slides at the end to demonstrate how the bank has really focused in on those areas and has some pretty strong remedies for breaches, substantial breaches in those areas. We ask for details of training plans. And I think then we also, there's two things we do about staff. One is that we want to know their qualification and experience, but we also have them named as key staff, so that we want to know who they are, and the fact that they'll be working on the project, and not basically taken off the project as soon as it's launched. So they're key staff, they're named within the contract, and that gives an expectation they will be working on that project, and they can only be removed with the agreement of the client. We've also tried to bring in some incentivization. So we have E&S performance security, which basically is part of the overall performance security, but it's an element that is carved out for E&S performance. And if there is poor performance in those areas, the bond can be called in. Now, this has two impacts. Obviously, it has a financial impact for that project and the contractor, but it also has a lasting impact because for bank projects, as I've mentioned already, we ask for declaration of past E&S performance, and they'd have to declare that they've had this performance security called in. And then finally, we have an E&S provisional sum, which provides an incentive for contractors to meet their E&S obligations. And in particular, what this really does is actually provides a sum of money for activities associated with E&S that are above and beyond those that are stated within the contract. And the very last point I'd like to bring out, it relates back to contract management. There is a very strong reporting requirement within the contracts, in particular around E&S and performance risks. Next slide, please. So I've really touched on these already, so I'm just going to go through them very quickly. So we've already mentioned the need to plan at the beginning and make sure that's built into the overall strategy. The E&S requirements that have to be built into the specification and then built into the contract. And then you have your performance standards, and those performance standards are then supported by reporting against key performance indicators. Next slide, please. I've mentioned active contract management, and then I'm just going to touch on now what happens in terms of an E&S breach. So the contract itself has some remedies. So I think one of the things that is often forgotten is that a breach of an E&S requirement in many ways is the same as the breach of any other requirement. So your normal contract remedies would exist for a breach associated with E&S. But there are some extra things that we can do, our clients can do, I should say, is that the borrower can activate the remedies for an E&S breach, including removal of personnel. So there is a clause that says the client can ask for people to be removed from site. And also, as I say, with other breaches, you can withhold payment. We can call in the performance security bond. And then finally, if there is a failure to deliver a specific E&S activity, it can result in no payment if it is specified within the provision of some activities. So just two last comments on this slide. The SPD, so the standard procurement documents, contain the E&S requirements as required. They are also embedded into the contract. Third time, as I keep saying, it's not in the contract, it doesn't get done. And we know well that if you put a change control through for a requirement you've forgotten, it often costs more than when it was included within the original bidding process. So it is really important to get those risks identified and the mitigation measures built into the contract. It's also worthy of note that the E&S requirements can be different depending on what's being procured. So it's goods, services, or consultants. The last few slides I've been focusing on large works, and that's been because that is our most complex area, and we have obviously the most, I guess, interventions, procurement interventions in that standard procurement document. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned the Contractors Code of Conduct, and this is an example. And I've put in the SPD references just to give you some idea of where these requirements embed themselves into our standard documents. So, as I said, each bidder must submit a code of conduct. Contractors' personnel in our definitions include subcontractors as well. So that code of conduct has to be undertaken and followed by the subcontractors as well. The code is project specific. So as I've said, contractors can add to what's already there, but they can't detract from it. And specifically, the code addresses sexual exploitation and abuse, SEA. Okay. And it appears in the SPD in the definition of contractors personnel. It appears in the data sheet. It appears in the bidding forms. And it also appears in a particular term of condition that is added to FIDIC. So you can see how it's integrated almost every part of the SPD. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of focus on the code of conduct. And just really, this is just a slide that illustrates the sort of things we would expect the contractor to do. So the code of conduct must be available. It must be in relevant languages. Must be displayed in the site and places that are accessible to the local communities and project affected people. The contractor has to seek to acknowledge receipt of the code. So that's the individual staff within the contractor. They must make sure they are given a copy. So there is a real focus on proactive activity to make sure that the code of conduct is well understood and hopefully adhered to. Next slide. So I've talked about FIDIC a number of times, and I've talked about the contractual structure. So the bank uses the FIDIC Red Book, and basically the E&S provisions in the Red Book are industry standard E&S provisions. Our particulars reflect the bank policy, and these include the ESF provisions. So they go into a step more detail and put a higher burden of responsibility on contractors to deliver the E&S requirements. Next slide, please. So I think the importance of reporting, as I've already mentioned, is integral to contract management. So the contract itself describes the instance which must be immediately notified to the supervising engineer. So any accident causing serious injury or death, any accident is likely to have a significant effect on the environment, affected communities, employers, personnel, gender-based violence, sexual exploitation, active incidents, damage to private property, and similar incidents. Historically, a number of these events across many clients, many organizations that do a lot of procurement haven't been reported. So this makes an immediate obligation to notify the supervising engineer. And then, of course, there are regular progress reports that will require reporting against the particular KPIs. And the metrics that we were looking for, or we look for, include environmental incidents of pollution, damage to groundwater, etc., health and safety, worker accommodation, gender stats in the workforce, training, grievances, and again, GBV, SEA incidents. So that's an example of the things that we would expect to be reported within a large works contract. Next slide, please. Okay, what I'd like to do for the remaining 5 minutes is just focus on the additional requirements that we've put in place for sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment. I've already mentioned that the bank has really shone a light on this area, and it's something that's very, very important to us. Next slide, please. So what we've done in our higher risk contracting areas associated with SEA and SH is added in even more requirements. So I'm just going to touch on what these mean, but just to highlight the 5 areas or so that we've added in. So we've added in bidder information relating to disqualification status. We've added in information about DAAB members, so that's the Dispute Arbitration Board members. We've added in the declaration specifically around SEA, SH. We've added in a section on prevention and response obligations, and then we've added in a process which would happen if there is a referral where somebody says that there has been an incident of SEA or SH, and how the contractual process works on that. Next slide, please. So in high-risk contracts, we've said the employer must organise and run an orientation conference as soon as possible after the constitution of the DAB and prior to the commencement of any physical work. So, as I've mentioned already, we're integrating this into the work that we're doing, and the physical work cannot start on site until this has been done. So the conference should be attended by the contractor, the engineer, the DAB members, and all relevant personnel and contractor members, etc. Next, sorry, not yet. Oh, can we go back a slide? That was my fault, sorry. So the objective is to make sure there is a common understanding. And this is in particular, and the information around the remedies, but this is in particular about the prevention, the referrals, dissatisfaction, and disqualification. So this is the first time I've mentioned disqualification. But if there is a breach of SEA and SH, and it is found to be a material breach, that the clients, through a mechanism with the bank, have the ability to disqualify contractors for up to a period of 2 years. I'm going to talk through that process in a little bit more detail. So this isn't the lists that banks use to say certain vendors cannot be invited to tender. This is a different process. It's purely a procurement process, but it involves a suspension or disqualification for a period of time. And I'm going to talk about that now in the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the triggers to actually refer an event to the DAB? So basically, if those requirements that I've mentioned already, if there is a breach or a suspected breach, and there are sort of three scenarios with which that can take place. The suspected breach can lead to a DAB referral. What the DAB then does is actually come in and investigate if there has been a breach of contract associated with the event. They're not actually undertaking assessment of whether the event took place or not, because the bank has a number of other mechanisms outside of procurement that investigate incidents associated with SEA and SH. Their investigation, so the DAB's investigation, is purely around making sure that the contract hasn't been breached and the contract provisions have been followed by the contractor. So scenario one, allegation of incident. The allegation is made by a person. So it's received by contractors, subcontractors, employer, engineer. Once that happens, that allegation has to be immediately shared with the other parties in the contract. And the employer will then make an immediate referral to the DAB, who then come in and do their investigation. Second scenario is the employer notices non-compliance. The engineer then gives notice to the contractor. If the contractor fails to comply with the notice to improve or the notice to correct, the employer will then make a referral to the DAB. Sorry, that's my headphones doing here. The other scenario is where the DAB notices a potential non-compliance. So the DAB, as part of its regular reviews and site visits, identifies potential non-compliance. If that's the case, the engineer then reviews the potential non-compliance and determines whether a notice to correct is issued. So you then have two scenarios. The engineer decides the contractor is compliant and provides the basis for this determination, and there's no further action. Or the engineer agrees with the DAB, they issue the notice to correct, and if the contractor fails to comply, then the employer makes a referral to the DAB. Next slide, please. So just to talk through very quickly how this works. And so as I've already mentioned, there is a trigger event. The next stage would be for the DAB to request the contractor to provide a statement of compliance. The DAB reviews the statement, and if the DAB finds non-compliance, you will then move into, they inform the bank is informed of the decision or the order, and then the TTL, so the task team leader, will liaise with the Chief Procurement Officer for a procedural review. And if the procedure is found to be correct, the operations VP can disqualify the contractor. And basically the contractor then can't bid for work for 2 years. And during that period, they would have to show and demonstrate that they have improved their processes and procedures to show that they're able and capable of bidding for future work. If the contractor doesn't agree with what's happened, obviously things can go to an emergency arbitrator. And then finally, they can go to full arbitration. So there are plenty of mechanisms to make sure that everything is transparent and is reviewed. But ultimately, if the contract is breached and it's a serious breach, the bank can suspend that contractor for 2 years. They can carry on that individual contract because the contract clearly is between the borrower and the supplier. But what the bank will do will stop them bidding for future work on any bank-funded projects. Next slide, please. So just to say, this is, and I think it's worth remembering, this is just for our highest risk contracts in works. So it's our high risk SEA, SH contracts. Next slide, please. Okay, so just in conclusion, I've talked about the many interventions that can be made from a procurement perspective. I've talked about how the requirements are integrated into our procurement documents, how they're integrated into planning, and obviously the need for contract management, reporting and contract management to make sure those things are delivered. And then finally, what the remedies could be if there was a breach of the contract associated with E&S requirements. I hope you found the presentation interesting, and I hope you can see how detailed the approach has been taken, the approach is to integrating these requirements into our procurement operations. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chair.
Many thanks, John, for a very elaborate and interesting presentation. Thank you very much. I would like to give the floor now to Mr. Atir Mohammed Hanoura from Egypt. The Egyptian experience in PPP projects has been a pioneering one in Africa. And Mr. Atir will take us along the experience of Egypt in procurement guidelines and procurement inclusion of sustainability in regard to PPP projects. Mr. Atir, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having us in this, giving us this opportunity. The presentation will have three parts. The first part is the institutional framework regarding the PP structure in the PP program in Egypt. And then we will go to the procurement and one of the projects that have resilience and sustainability dimensions. The institutional structure in Egypt regarding the PP, we have three main levels. The first level is the Supreme Committee, which is headed by the Prime Minister with a permanent membership of 9 ministers. Minister of Finance, Minister of Planning, Minister of Investment, Minister of Legal Affairs, Minister of Transportation, Minister of Housing and Utilities, Minister of Municipalities, and Minister of Internal of Trade and Industry. Plus, who is in my position as a director of the PP. This is the Supreme Committee. The second layer is the PP Central Unit, which is the implementation party. The PP Central Unit, the implementing agency throughout all the sectors in Egypt, and the Supreme Committee is the policy and the approval layer. Then we go to the third level, which is the satellite units inside different line ministries and authorities who are having PPP projects to tender and to manage the contract after that. We succeeded in the last few years to establish PP satellite units in each and every line ministry that we are dealing with them. Ministry of Housing, Ministry of Transportation, Ministry of Waters and Resources, Ministry of Education, and different others. Now they're under training and they gained a lot of experience. At a level we can leave them to manage the procurement systems alone with a minimal supervision from the PP Central Unit. Currently, we are involved in each and every step in procurement and procedures that in the project. Next, please. The main goal of the Supreme Committee is setting and it's the national policy. So it's a policy maker However, it goes into different approval authorities. Like when we build up the pipeline after screening, we have to present this pipeline to the Supreme Committee and to provide them with the justification. Why did we take this project in the PP scheme, and why this project was eliminated? And then they have to approve it. Once they approve it, we start the feasibility studies and the different environmental and technical and financial studies, and we present the outcome of each and every project to the Supreme Committee to get its individual approval on. Once we get the approval on this from the Supreme Committee, we start the procurement life cycle. They also, any of the line ministers requires to cancel any of the projects that have been approved, they have to present it to the Supreme Committee, justify that, and the Supreme Committee might say yes or no. So approval on the pipelines, approval on each project, modification of the project, we have to present it to them, and they are issuing the rules and general criteria of the PP and endorsing standard PP contracts. The last thing I want to say here is that the dispute resolutions, mechanism of dispute resolution, each time we have to present it to the Supreme Committee contract by contract. Next, please. The PP Central Unit, I want to give you the organization chart very quickly. This is the new organization chart that we are expanding now because we've based on the amendments of the law, which was approved 3 months ago, the scope of the PPs in Egypt have been expanded, and accordingly, we need to expand within the PP Central Unit in terms of capacity and add or include more personnel to the PP Central Unit, and as well expanding with the satellite units at the different line ministries or authorities. Next, please. This is the main structure of the PP, of the PP Central Unit, with the three main departments, and each department have got its own specific. The first one is for the feasibility studies and the financing. The second one is the project tendering central department, and this is categorized in sectors. So you'll find water sector, social sector, and so on. The third one is the contract implementation and follow-up under legal studies central department. These are the three main departments that we have in the next, please. The main role of the PP Central Unit, I don't want to take you through it, but the role of the PP Central Unit changes from one stage to another at the life cycle of the project. During the project preparation, which I have to say that it's the most important and crucial part of the project cycle. Preparation of the project will make it or break it. We have to make sure we don't have to compromise any. We take no compromise in the studies. Without real, robust studies that you can trust, you will not be able to structure a PP project properly. So we are very much involved in the studies and preparation. We submit or we escalate the results of the studies to the Supreme Committee for the approval, and then we go for the procurement phase. We structure the procurement phase, and we are involved with the line ministry because they are the owners of the project. We're involved with them in each and every step of the procurement. After that, we work with them closely till we reach the commercial and the financial closure. Once the financial closure is there, we step a little bit back and monitor the performance of the private sector and the public sector. And if we see there's anything when we have to interfere with the public sector and involve them and inform them what would be the right approach to avoid any problems or any disputes in the project. Next, please. That's the satellite units role, which currently is limited. Till they reach their maturity, the role will be almost the role of the satellite unit in their sector. That's in a nutshell. Next, please. We have the PPP law, which is issued law 67 to the year 2010, and actually it took the best PP law for the year 2010 from the World Bank. It has 4 chapters. The first chapter is general provisions and definitions. The PP contract and related advisory contracts, how to select and contract the advisors. Introduction and definitions of the entities related to the law, who is applicable to apply this law. The role of the regulatory bodies, which is very important, should be involved in the preparation of the project. Changes of the PP contract and how to manage this changes. Project assets, ownership of project assets and the transfer of the project assets. Subcontracts and performing and reporting system. Next, please. Chapter 2 is establishing the PP central unit and the Supreme Committee and the satellite units. So that's the institutional part, and setting the roles, as I mentioned before. Next, please. Chapter 3 is the chapter that I like, which is the procurement or the procurement and tendering procedures. Starting from the expression of interest, pre-qualification, RFP, public sector comparators, the competitive dialogue or the two-stage tendering, the final RFP evaluation committees. I want you to, if you go through the PPP law, this chapter, and the executive regulation, especially the African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, the World Bank, of course, you will find the procurement system is very much similar to the international procurement system that we've adopted in the World Bank and the Islamic Development Bank has all the IFIs. Being an ex-World Bank, I got all the best practices, and I avoided all the problems that we face sometime in other procurement. Next, please. The chapter 4 is the PP contract head of terms, what the contract should not miss. Dispute resolutions, the law of implementation, the forming the SPVs, insolvency of the SPVs, special purpose vehicles, the project company, as we say it, the contract assignments, the relationship between the lenders and the direct agreement, which is the we call it, by the end of the day, the sovereign guarantee that the Treasury provide for some of the project, because to turn it bankable and to reduce the payment risk or collection risk for payment risks. Investors Complaints Committee. This is a committee formed in the law, headed by the Minister of Finance, who is involved in studying each complaint from any of the investors or any of the bidders. And this committee have 2 judges in it. And this committee, by the end of the day, is the decision of this committee is forced to be implemented. This is giving actually a lot of comfort to the bidders. And next, please. Throughout the last 11 years of implementation, we found that we need to have this. We have to take our law for another step. So we succeeded to pass our amendments, our PP law amendments, which was issued in December 2021, and the executive regulations now are in the final legal revision to be issued within the next 2 weeks. The main topics of this amendments is to accelerate the tendering process, okay, and shorten a little bit some of the procedures that we can may do. The second is to widen the range of projects that we included under this law. So we're working now with the ministries of environment, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Youth and Sports. I mean, different sectors now are, in other words, all of the government sectors now included by this amendment. The most important and challenging here is introducing new forms of contracting methods, like the direct order, the limited tenders, okay, and the unsolicited bids. Unsolicited bids is something challenging. And actually, we have a new methodology in our law and executive regulation. We didn't use the very famous Swiss challenge because we believe that it's not applicable. It's fake, we can say this. And we introduced something new, which is, we call it the Egyptian challenge, and it's registered now as WAP in the United Nations. There is no actually a chance to discuss it now because there is another thing to be said. And we created a new committee between the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Planning, okay, to establish and to create the pipeline. Ministry of Planning is the entity that receives all the infrastructure and investment projects coming from all the government, and they have to prioritize them. Then the Ministry of Finance and the PP Central Unit comes on the table in this committee and do the initial screening and select which project could be done under the PP structure, and then go to the Supreme Committee to approve. These are the main general amendments, but there's something important here I want to add, is the evaluation committee have the right, and this was the first time we give this kind of right to a committee. The evaluation committee have the right to reject the cheapest, or let me say, the best financial offer. If this offer, financial offer, is far from other bidders or far from the public sector competitor. For instance, if all the bidders are $100, for instance, and $95 and $85 and $90, and one bidder is 57 or 60, very far. Okay, he's the best, but it's very far. Okay, then we have this committee have the right to call him and ask him to justify this very strange pricing. Unless he justify it and prove through his financial model and his banks that he have a real justification for this price, then this price will be, or this bid will be rejected, and we'll take the best bidder following. Because we've done this because we've learned it the hard way. We received, or we awarded the best bidder, price-wise and technical-wise, and in practice, they couldn't fulfill it. They couldn't do the project. We tried with them every which way over 5 years, but by the end of the day, they failed because it was proven that they didn't calculate all the risks. They didn't calculate properly their bid, and accordingly, the project was canceled. We as a government was affected. The private sector also was affected, and we lost an effort for 5 or 6 years, and we are retendering it again. So this was a very important amendments to our law. Next, please. This is now we are back to the point of the webinar, which the sustainability and resilience of the project. I just selected one of the projects that by nature is sustainable. It's by nature green. But I selected this project because it is in implementation. It's a sophisticated project. And there is more than 3 or 4 parties working together in this project. The project is between the private sector consortium, or let me say the service provider. On the other hand, the municipality, who is the owner of the project. Okay, but this project is turning the waste, municipal waste, into energy. So the municipality or the governorate have to send 1,000 tons of waste to the service provider every day. The service provider has to recycle it and get power out of it. You have to send this power to the grid of the electricity company. Okay, so now we've got the electricity company as another party. The electricity company, when it receives the power and accept it, they pay the power, the cost of the power, to the municipality, not to the service provider. The municipality takes this money and they add a little bit on it, something like 30% or 40%, and take this both components of the payment and they pay it to the service provider. Plus, we have the Ministry of Environment involved. We have the Authority of Waste Management involved. We have the regulator of the power and electricity involved. Okay, plus the implementing parties, plus Ministry of Finance is involved, because in case that the municipality didn't pay on time to the service provider, the Ministry of Finance, or the Treasury, let me say, will step in and pay, okay, to keep this project up and running and to keep the service provider secured with his banks in receiving his money, to set the banks debt and to have enough money to operate, because we have to have this project operating smoothly, sustainably throughout the project life cycle. Next, please. I just explained the structure of the project because I think that this cycle might not be that clear, but if we can see that the governorate, we have an arrow, blue arrow, okay, and a red cycle arrow at the left. This cycle, the cycle red arrow shows that the governorate has to supply the waste to the SPV plant free of charge. So they have to send them on a daily basis 1,000 tons of waste. The SPV will recycle it, and then the electricity will be supplied to the electricity distribution company. The electricity distribution company will pay to the government, and the government will take the rest of the money required from the hygiene fund affiliated to the governorate. So the blue arrows are the flow of funds, flow of money. It's almost 1 Egyptian pounds, 1.03 Egyptian pounds per kilowatt hour from the electricity company, 0.37 Egyptian pounds per kilowatt hour coming from the hygiene fund to the governorate. The governorate will pay the full 1.4 Egyptian pound per kilowatt hour to the service provider. These are 3 contracts. The first contract, the concession contract between the SPV and the governorate. The second one, which is in the robust, the second contract, it is called the connectivity to the grid contract, which is between the governorate and the SPV and the electricity company. The third contract is between the electricity company and the governorate, which is power purchase agreement. Okay, so this is the cycle of the relation between the parties, plus the regulatory bodies, Ministry of Environment, Authority of Waste Management, and the regulatory body of Power and Construction. Next, please. This is the fourth contract. The fourth contract between the SPV and the governorate or the municipality, the Ministry of Finance, and the banks. We call it the direct agreement. By the end of the day, this is the contract that arranges the step-in agreements, okay, for the banks to step in case that the service provider did not comply with all the environmental and technical and legal aspects. And in case that the governorate didn't pay, Ministry of Finance has to step in and pay to secure the sustainability and to secure the smoothly implementation of the contract. Because any interruption of this contract will have direct environmental problem. Waste will be everywhere in the streets. Recycling will turn to be either in the landfills or they will be burning it out. Okay, and we have direct environmental issue, and we have a problem with the contract, which is another financial problem. This is the project in general. To have this project in ground, actually, we went through all these procedures, and actually they are in the final phase of revision for the agreements, and we expect to sign it within the next 8 weeks. The projects, these are 8 projects tendered in 8 different municipalities as a pilot project. In Egypt, we need something like 40 or 45 projects like this spread over the country. We started with 8 sites in Delta, in Cairo, in Alexandria, and in North and South Upper Egypt. So it's a sample of 8 governorates all over the country. To reach this, I'll take you back to the preparation phase. This was tough. The preparation phase was a tough exercise because we had arguments with the Ministry of Environment. They are the leaders, and I have to admit that they are the owners of the project. They want to put all kind of restrictions, and they want, actually, they were exaggerating in the restrictions because they want to set the scene once and for all. But on the other hand, some of their requirements were not applicable. So we got consultants and see how can we mitigate these risks? How can we follow all the environmental aspects as much as we can without turning this project to be very expensive, and accordingly, it's not a PP project anymore, and the government has to go for it. This was a very tricky part, and it took some good time from us because I have to admit, green projects and green economy and net zero economy is new. Not only new to Egypt, it's new to everybody. We, as a PP project, because they always throw all the sophisticated projects to the PP, we got advisors to start solving this with us, because this is a pilot project, and we want to learn from it how to manage the following 30 or 40 projects. Finally, it took us something like a year, let me say, It's not it's a pilot projects. We are learning. Our learning curve is increasing, but I can say that we have a real robust documents, studies, and we have 8 international operators with 8 Egyptian companies in different consortia are awarded, and we will expect to sign this contract within the next 8 weeks, inshallah. Thank you very much. Next, please. This is, if you're interested, the feed-in tariff calculation, how the payments, two sections of the payments was calculated. The feed-in tariff is 1.4 Egyptian pound per kilowatt hour. This was calculated based on the dollar is 17.5 Egyptian pounds. Okay, and any variation in the exchange rate of the Egyptian dollar to the Egyptian pounds within 5 plus or minus 5%, this tariff will be continue the same. If the changes is 1%, 3% plus or minus, so there is no changes. And Ministry Electricity Distribution Company will pay 1.03 per kilowatt hour, and the Hygiene Fund will pay 0.37 per kilowatt hour. Next, please. In case that the dollar rate is less than 17.5, like 1 year ago, when the or 6 months ago, when the dollar was dropped from 17.5 to 15.6, and it continued for about 3 years or 2 years or more, 15.7, 15.6, 15.65. So if the dollar rate less than 17.5, how this would be calculated? 41.41 Egyptian pounds will be paid untouched. 0.62 of the Egyptian pounds per kilowatt hour will be multiplied by the new exchange rate divided by 17.5. So this means that this 1.03 will be reduced in case that the dollar rate, exchange rate was less than 17.5. And the 0.37 of the Hygiene Fund will continue to be as is. Next, please. That's the third case. Dollar rate is higher than 17.5, which is the case as we are talking. Now it's 18.5, 18.3 almost. So in this case, the 1.3, the electricity distribution company will stay as is. This portion will stay as is. And the exchange rate will be calculated or multiplied by the 0.37. This is the structure of the feed-in tariff, which we tried to include the dollar, the exchange rate in it to compensate as much as you can the service providers. Thank you very much, and sorry for being a little bit long.
Thank you very much, Mr. Atir Hanura, for a very elaborate presentation on the Egyptian experience with PPP. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Munsif Ziani to reflect to us the experience of consultants in incorporating sustainable procurement in design of development projects. Mr. Munsif, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Brother Mohammed. The presentation started about 1 hour and 40 minutes ago. I hope your attention is still very high. I will try to be brief, but my objective through this presentation is to share with you some thoughts on how consulting engineers take into account sustainable development issues, and above all, how they can do more and better in that direction. these thoughts I would like to share with you come from my experience, of course, on IDB projects, but also with other international institutions, and also in different countries around Africa. Next slide, please. I would like to, as an introduction, give a very simple definition of sustainable development. And I like the one that says the sustainable development is development that leaves no one behind. This is really very short, very expressive, and it is in accordance with the definition given by IDB. Because when we say that we have to take into account the needs of vulnerable people, of women, for example, of future generation, among others. Speaking about consultant engineers, let me remind you that, of course, they play a crucial role in achieving human needs, and therefore, they are a major driver in sustainable developments as they connect social needs with appropriate technological solutions. In that respect, consulting engineers are on the forefront to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, by using their scientific knowledge and experience to turn innovative ideas into sustainable projects for the benefit of all. Furthermore, and when we speak about public or private procurements, we can say that consulting engineers play or should play a key role to promote sustainability for two main reasons. The first reason is that consulting engineers are often involved in all the stages of the procurement process, from the identification of the needs and, until the project delivery, and they can go further during the operation of the project. And the second reason is that sustainability requirements may not systematically and clearly be stated in all the procurement phases, or they can be stated but not mandatory. Let me give you the example of the IDB. IDB, of course, we find some requirements in the guidelines, but we find also other recommendation in the guidance notes on social, gender, and sustainable public procurement. But as you know, this guidance note is not mandatory, and its implementation is left at the beneficiary discretion. In this situation, and for these reasons, consultant engineers should advocate for inclusion of sustainable development requirements at all the stages of the procurement process. Next slide, please. I would like, before sharing with you thoughts about the consultant engineer new approaches, just remind you of some baselines. I classified them here on the three level: international, regional, and national level. Among the international baselines, of course, we find the United Nations, SDGs, of course, but also all the information we can get from the IPCC reports, and mainly the annual one that they prepare for the annual meeting of COP. Second example of international baseline is FIDIC. I will not detail this. John has spoken about FIDIC contracts, but let me add that FIDIC produces lots of recommendations through its SDC, which is the Sustainable Development Committee, where I used to sit for 3 years. And one of the recent publication of FIDIC in this order is the Climate Change Charter, which was launched last year. And this document sets out specific actions to be taken by individual engineers, by consulting firms, by national consulting associations, and by project teams to tackle climate change challenges and deliver sustainable projects. Now, on the regional level, I mentioned as a good example what IDB requires on sustainable developments, the guidance note I mentioned before, and also what does FCIC, our Federation of Consultants from Islamic countries. We have organized many seminars on this subject. And let me just remind you that we have recently updated our strategic plan, and sustainability is taking a very important part in this strategic plan. At the national level, of course, we can found local regulation, NDCs can give good recommendation on sustainability, but also best practices coming not only from authorities, but also from public sector of these countries. Next slide, please. Now, having said that, how consulting engineer deals about the necessity to introduce sustainable requirements into their design. First, number one, of course, since many years now, it is recommended to use the three-dimensional life cycle approach. Brother Amir Ghani spoke about that. This is very important. We should more and more use this approach instead of the traditional approach focused only on or mainly on economic aspects. And as it is mentioned on the IDB guide notes, I like the one it is expressed. Three-dimensional life cycle approach does not mean that it takes 3 times longer than the traditional approach, and it doesn't cost more than the traditional cost. It is the opposite. Adopting this approach may generate savings in the cost of project. But this approach, the three-dimensional life cycle, unfortunately, it is not always specifically mentioned in the terms of references of design studies. So my recommendation would be that it has to be imposed in the term of references of design studies. Second point here is the necessity to have an early inclusion of sustainable development considerations and early stage of procurement and early stage of design. We could, for example, this is one of the recommendations I would like to make. We could, for example, put among the selections factors while comparing engineering consultant bids, the way these consultants take into account sustainable development issues through their proposed methodology. We should have a specific factor to note how this is dealt in their methodology. The third point on this slide, I wanted to mention the necessity to target resilience design. This may appear obvious, but that means that, for example, taking into account potential climate change future effects because it has been proven that it costs much less building a resilient project than adapting it later during its operation. Fourth point here, I skipped the third one, excuse me, the target constantly, of course, keep in mind the SDGs. This is I think, evident. And on the 5 points, I would like to say that in order to be sure, to be able to take into account sustainable development issues, we have more and more, we are more and more obliged to reshape our project teams. We need first to introduce more and more diversity, inclusiveness, and local expertise in project teams. And second, these teams have to adopt interdisciplinary approach and avoid operating in silos. 6 point here is I want to make some comments on the environmental impact assessments. Of course, this sort of assessment has been now generalized all over the world, and especially on large projects. But I would like to underline 2 points. The first one is that while these assessments have been generalized, we still need to put more effort on the follow-up of these assessment conclusion and recommendations. And the second point is that it is related to the need to involve more civil society players while conducting these environmental impact assessments. I can give the example here that a personal experience where working on the design of fishing ports, the government obliged us as consulting engineer to discuss with the fishermen themselves. And more than that, the assessment has to be in a certain way approved by the fishermen before we could deliver it to the clients. The 7th point here deals about innovation. Of course, to achieve sustainable development needs, we need more and more innovation. And I would like here to highlight the fact that the procurement process have to give consultant engineers the opportunity to introduce innovative solutions. I'm saying that because in many countries where I have operated, most of public investors are reluctant to innovative solutions and prefer to go for classical and standard solutions, which don't always respond to sustainability issues. And finally, the point 8 here, dealing about climate finance, it is just to say that consultant engineers should be aware of climate finance requirements, which can be very constraining in order to deliver projects eligible to these kind of finance, especially in developing countries where the needs are huge, especially for adaptation resilience. Next slide, please. I would like to end my presentation by saying that in order to address sustainable development challenges in a more efficient way and in a holistic way, consultant engineer should not stand alone as a profession. We are obliged to discuss and to interact and to collaborate with other stakeholders. I gave here the example of the necessity to discuss and to collaborate with decision makers and investors. First, to promote sustainable development and improve their knowledge. I worked more in developing countries than in developed countries, and the knowledge about sustainable development is not very well understood in some clients, especially, for example, in municipalities. In ministries, we can find a lot of capabilities, but in municipalities, we have, as consulting engineer, the duty to inform them about all these issues, sustainability development. Let me now speak about the collaboration with contractors. As we are working almost all the time on the same project, it is obvious that we have to engage common actions, for example, on advocacy, on sustainability advocacy, or in capacity building for our staffs, since we deal more or less the same issues for sustainability. Third example of stakeholders where consulting engineers have already many collaboration, but we should do more, is with architects and urban planners, especially for land use planning and early architectural design that should integrate sustainability issues. And last example I gave here is the necessity to collaborate with engineer educators and professional engineering institutes, because we need appropriate skills to tackle sustainability issues, to respond to the call for more sustainable procurement, and to ensure that the standard of engineering education address the sustainability challenges. I try to be very brief because I know I'm the last speaker and we should save some time for discussion. So I finished, Mr. Chairman. I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Monsef Ziani, for making up for the time. Well, I would like to open the floor now for questions and answer sessions, but I would like to check with our administrators how much time we're left, because according to me, we're only left with maybe 4 or 5 minutes from our planned time allocation. So do we have more time to open the floor for questions and answers? Administrator, please.
I think we have time to take a few questions. Maybe we can take 15 minutes more.
Okay. I would like for the remote participants to send their questions in writing and specify which speakers they want to respond to their questions. But in the meantime, I have 4 questions that have been already allocated by some particular participants. I would give the floor first to Mr. Taha Al-Fil. I think you have one question to Mr. Husham Mirani. Please, Mr. Taha Al-Fil.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman of FCIC. I would like to extend my deep thanks to all our esteemed speakers for their valuable and interesting presentation. My question actually is addressed to Engineer Atar Hanoura from the Egyptian Ministry of Finance. So he presented in his presentation a sustainable project by nature, as he stated. So my question is the following: what are the procurement measures and methodologies that should be allowed the government of Egypt to maintain a balanced BBB contract with the other party? Thank you.
This is a
Okay, your name, please. I'm the participant who sent your name, please. Are you Mr. Alfi?
yes, I believe
Your
so.
name, please.
Yes, I'm Tahal Field. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Mr. Atir, please.
I'll try to explain this. Actually, to receive or to have a balanced contract, we have to start it from the very beginning. Balanced contract is a very important measure in the PP. The imbalanced contract means that the risks are higher at the side of any of these parties, and it might turn the project imbankable, non-bankable. To achieve this balanced contract, it starts from the preparation phase. When we're structuring the project and doing all the preparation, normally we get contracts and we involve at high level the major or the main players in this industry from the technical and environmental point of view. And also they come with their banks. So we involve as well the major banks that might be interested in such projects, from the local banks or the sovereign funds like Abu Dhabi Fund or Egyptian Sovereign Fund or Kuwait Fund and others, and the IFIs, the Islamic Development Bank, the World Bank, IFC, the EBRD, and so on, to get their feedback and to get to feel their risks or the threats that they have. So we structure the project to the best of our knowledge based on the feedbacks and the dialogues that we maintain with the different parts. The most important part is the procurement. When we start the procurement, we start with the pre-qualification, and only the qualified consortium, the qualified bidders, are requested to purchase the tender document and start with the procurement. We give them, once they purchase the tender document, we give them something between 4 weeks to 6 weeks, depending on the project, for them just to read the documents. And I have to say that the full-fledged contract with its 18 or 19 annexes are part of the tender documents. So the contract have got all the financial, technical, environmental, legal, compensations, all these aspects are in the contract. So we give them the full-fledged contract for them to read, to absorb, and to come to us with their clarifications. Here's the point. We don't limit their involvement or the bidder's involvement in the clarification. So if something not clear, we explain it to them. No, the clarification is part of their rights, and we give them the full right if they found any article or any sector in the tender documents, even evaluation, and in the contract, okay, any aspect, legal, financial, technical, whatever, and if they find it needs to be changed from their point of view, they have to write down which document or annex and write down the article itself. And on the third column, they have to write the new wording. They want to change this article to so and so and so. Okay. And the fourth column is the most important for us, is why. I have to understand from where they're coming. So we get all their feedback, and we classify it, and we send them the clarification on it. And actually, I have to admit that almost 60% or 55% of their requests are alerts for us, and we take it in consideration. The most important is the second phase, the second step. After we get all the clarification and respond to them, we give them an additional 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and then we do something called the one-to-one meeting. It's in our law. The law allows the PP unit and the public authority to sit with each and every bidder alone, separately. Because bidders, I was a bidder before I come to the World Bank and then moved to the government. And I used to do all the naughty issues that a bidder can do. The public conference, bidders, especially in sophisticated projects like this, they don't want to give all their questions because their questions and clarification might indicate their solutions, and they don't want to speak it out loud with other competitors. So we sit with them, get all the information, and then we study it with our advisors, and then 2 weeks later, we issue the amended tender document with the amended contract, okay, and give them after that 3 to 4 months to compile the project. By this procedure, we've done the following. We've negotiated the contract with each and every bidder, okay? We used their consultants and the legal and advisors and technical advisors to review our contracts, to enhance it. We, all the bidders assume ownership and responsibility on the contract because they amended and they changed the contract to their best knowledge and the best interest, okay? And after that, once we are awarded, we take this amended contract, fill in the spaces, and then sign it. We don't sit for lengthy negotiation because it's negotiated first. And accordingly,
thank you very much, Mr. Atir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Atir. Thank you. I would like now to ask our participant, Mr. Muhannad Al-Sanusi, to raise his question. Mr. Muhannad Al-Sanusi, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Hello all. My name is Muhannad Al-Sanusi. I'm a marketing manager for New Tech Consulting Group. I wish to thank all the presenters and the panelists for these very informative presentations. I have a couple of questions, both addressed to Mr. John Rowland. My first question is that since the consultants are tasked with monitoring and reporting on environmental and social aspects during work supervision, this would definitely entail the provision of certain experts and inputs that are sometimes overlooked in the borrower's terms of reference. I believe there is a provisional sum provided for these aspects for contractors. Don't you think it is high time to include these provisional sums for consultants as well, in order to make sure that these aspects are properly taken care of? My second question relates particularly to post-review procurement of the World Bank, where some projects are being sampled after the contract award, and which makes it a bit late to review on whether the ESS aspects have already been incorporated into the documents and taken care of. So how does the World Bank and other IFIs address this issue? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Muhannad. Williams, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, yeah, I'm off mute. Thank you very much. In terms of your first question, I think I've already alluded to part of that in my presentation, which is the requirement for consultants to have the specialist skills or the areas of expertise around E&S should be built into the consultant's terms of reference. And that should include any additional skills or external support needed. So that would be my first part of it. The second part is that if it emerges during the delivery of the project that the consultant needs additional skills that they don't have available, that should be accommodated through a change control. So I don't see any mechanisms within the consultancy contract that limit the ability for a consultant to get the right skills in to undertake the appropriate management of the E&S requirements in any contracts. In terms of your second question, you're right. Post-review is after the event, and the bank only takes a relatively small sample, and that's a risk-based decision based on obviously value and risk, but also a request from our board to spend less time in checking lower value, lower risk, and to spend more time on what we would say is strategically critical, so larger contracts, larger risk. The prior or the post-review and indeed prior review processes are procurement methods. So although the procurement team can undertake an assessment to make sure that the E&S requirements look like they're in there. Ultimately, the requirement to do that is the project team, so the TTL and the team, and in particular the E&S specialist who works as part of the team. So there are obviously a few mechanisms that if the contract is international competition, it has to use the bank standard procurement documents. And in doing so, the minimum requirements around E&S are built into those terms and conditions. So that reduces the risk to a degree. Obviously, if it's a works contract using FIDIC, we have the particular terms and conditions built into that contract as well. And obviously, what we've done with the standard bidding document, we've actually put placeholders in the specifications section for clients to answer. So we've provided the tools for our clients to consider those areas. And obviously, as part of the overall project management, it is for the task team to make sure that E&S considerations are being built into the procurement process. I recognize that post-review means that often the actions can only be taken after the event. But I think also it's worth saying that because the E&S requirements are built into the financing agreement, there is a light shone on those elements that need to be considered by our clients. As I said at the beginning, it's a risk-based approach. If we were to review every contract prior to award, contracts would never get awarded, or we'd have to have a small army of people to do that work. I hope you feel that answers your question. By all means, if you've got any clarifications, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John. I would like now to give the floor to Mr. Al-Haj Somar. I believe you have a question to Mr. Husham. The floor is yours.
Okay, now thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Let me take the opportunity first to congratulate the panel member. I think it is a very fruitful and productive workshop, right? Because it will help to promote sustainable procurement in our member country as per this SDG 12.7. This SDG will help to promote sustainable procurement in line with priority national public procurement. I think also this workshop will give insight and to better consider this ESS requirement, right, in MDB project preparation. Why? Because when preparing this procurement strategy in the section operational context, you have this sustainable requirement. In the stakeholder, I think it was mentioned by John William and Monsef, you have stakeholder engagement, and here I mean the civil society. It's very critical. And downstream also, you will have the implementation in the procurement approach of the procurement strategy. It will help also during the implement of the project from the planning, the bidding process, the evaluation, and during contract management to track this ESS requirement. But I want to tackle first in the policy side because I'm the custodian of policy in IDB, El-Haj Malik Sumare. I want, because before implementing, you have to tackle in the policy side first. I think and also I have the opportunity to be part of the working group to design this methodology of assessment procurement system with OECD and also MDB, these maps. We develop one module, very important, sustainable procurement. This module will be used by all the country for self-assessment or by all the MDB. It could be applied as a standalone or regarding with the MAPS core assessment. In this case, I want just to take the opportunity of this forum, very appropriate because it is among the annual meeting assignment of the bank. And the report in terms of recommendation, I think it will be very relevant to put this outcome and finding. I was thinking in my question, what kind of incentive MDB can use to help member country to promote sustainable procurement in their regulation? Thank you so much. Over to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Dr. Husham, would you like to respond? to this question, please?
Okay, so thank you to Mr. Al-Haj Somari. So thank you very much for this, Brother Somari. So you're talking about regulations in countries. So there is lots of aspects, as covered during the, the webinar. So I believe that my first point here is that I believe there is already, you will find in lots of countries, some regulations in place. For example, environmental protection regulations. So environmental issues have been with us for quite a long time, in the, we're talking about decades, 30, 40 years or more. So even a lot of our member countries, which are developing countries, you will still find environmental protection laws. And of course, labor laws regarding minimum wage and all these, labor protection issues, they are standard, I think, on almost, universally. When you are doing your assessments, you have to look at the gaps, that needs to be looked at. So I can give one example, which I saw, for example, which is something very relevant. For example, construction safety regulations. I have seen regulations in some of our member countries that only cover industrial sites, which means that they cover like factories, workshops, and the like, fixed working locations in industrial type activities. But regulations specific to construction safety, which is the last S in the ESHS, obligations. So construction safety on large and complex projects, this is very important because you get a lot of damage, loss of life, injuries due to operations of machinery, excavations, scaffolding, and all these, safety issues. And in developed countries, there is detailed construction safety regulations. And if they're not, covered by national regulations, then you will just have to depend, on the procedures and the plans, set up for that particular contract. Why? Because the national laws do not cover it. So maybe, we can help countries, to develop this and, look into maybe the possibility of doing this. The other point is that, countries should be able to see the benefits. As I mentioned, there can be lots of financial benefits. For example, as I mentioned in the example regarding application of life cycle costing, there's a lot of economic, benefits to be gained. There's also reputational issues, environmental damage, and issues that affect local populations and so on. They damage really the reputation, of the executing agencies, and they have to be, take care of their reputations. So I'll stop here and hand back to the, moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hisham. Actually, there is one question to Mr. Munsaf Ziani regarding the capacity of consultancy in member countries relative to sustainability in development projects. Do you think that the consultants in their present capacity have enough pool of staff qualified in the field of sustainability? Mr. Munsaf Ziani, please.
Thank you, Mohammed, for your question. Well, it is a very important question because in engineering firms, the capital of an engineering firm is its staff. It's the level of its staff. Concerning the capacity to deal with the sustainability issues, I may say that in general, we can find a lot of skills available, especially among young engineers, because the new generation, young engineers, are very concerned by sustainability. They are very happy to work on these issues of sustainability. The difficulty is that remains in the fact that we don't always succeed to attract them to work in our sector as engineering firms, for the simple reason that consulting is a relatively hard job and not always offering high salaries. I regret to say it, compared to other sectors like finance or contractors. Also speaking about skills, the difficulty we have more and more is to find qualified project manager. Qualified project manager able to conduct large project with many sustainability issues. This project manager, of course, have to be aware and familiar with the sustainable development issues, but they must also be able to make all their teams members work in synergy, because as I said in my presentation before, taking into account sustainable development challenges requires interdisciplinary and cross-sectorial approach. So this is the difficulty. This is the second difficulty we have in getting qualified staff in this manner. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Munsaf Diani. My question to our administrator: is there any more questions displayed? I don't see any more questions displayed. Yeah, there is one question. Yeah, actually, this is not a question. I think Norman Agiri is responding to Mr. Husham Marghani. Yeah. Administrator, is there any more questions, or we can now close our meeting? Okay. All right. I don't see any more questions, so I would like to thank all participants. I'm glad to announce that we had a very large number of participants in this webinar, and I would like to thank them all for their active participation. I would like to extend my thanks to all speakers who have been wonderful, and I would like to apologize for exceeding our time allocation. So this has been a very successful and informative webinar, and I look forward to see you all in Sharm el-Sheikh. Thank you all.
Sure. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.